Pastor Williams, I need to tell you something that's been eating at my soul for 3 long years. You know what they say. The truth will set you free, but first it'll make you miserable. Well, I reckon I'm about to find out just how miserable a man can get. I'm sitting here in this hospital waiting room, watching my Margaret fight for her life, and I can't shake the feeling that this is all my fault. That German shepherd of hers, Duke, he knew something was wrong before any of us did. My mother always said, when something don't smell right, it usually ain't. And Duke's been acting peculiar for weeks now. See? Margaret was supposed to be my wife yesterday. Instead, she's lying in that ICU with poison coursing through her veins, and the whole town thinks she died of an epileptic seizure. But Duke wouldn't let them close that coffin, jumped right in there and refused to budge, like he was guarding her soul itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. 3 years ago, I was just going through the motions at my veterinary clinic here in Cedar Falls. Lost my wife to cancer 5 years prior, and most days felt like I was sleepwalking through life. Then Margaret burst through my doors on that rainy September morning, cradling what looked like a dying German shepherd puppy wrapped in her favorite cardigan. "Please, you have to help him," she pleaded, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I found him on Highway 67 hit by a car. The driver just kept going." Her voice cracked with emotion as she gently stroked the unconscious pup's head. I took one look at that mangled little body and shook my head grimly. The puppy's hip was shattered, his breathing shallow and labored. "Ma'am, I have to be honest with you. His injuries are severe. Even if we save him, he might never walk properly again. The surgery alone will cost thousands, and there's no guarantee he'll make it through the night." Margaret's jaw set with determination I'd rarely seen in my 30 years of practice. "I don't care about the money. Every creature deserves a second chance. That's what my mama taught me. Please try." For 6 grueling hours, I performed the most delicate surgery of my career on that puppy's shattered bones. Margaret never left the waiting room, pacing the worn linoleum, whispering prayers, calling every hour for updates. When I finally emerged, exhausted but cautiously optimistic, I found her asleep in the uncomfortable plastic chair, still clutching that blood-stained cardigan. "He made it through surgery," I said gently, touching her shoulder. She startled awake, hope flooding her tired face. But the next 72 hours will be critical. What happened next still gives me chills. Margaret stayed by that puppy's side for 3 straight days, sleeping on my clinic floor, feeding him by hand, talking to him in soft, encouraging whispers. Encouraging. I'd been a veterinarian for 3 decades, but I'd never witnessed such devotion from a stranger for an animal that might not even survive. But Duke, that's what she named him, did more than survive. Against all medical odds, he not only walked again, but grew into a magnificent 90-pound German shepherd with intelligence that amazed everyone who met him. The bond between Margaret and Duke was unlike anything I'd ever seen. As I watched her nurse that broken puppy back to health, I felt something in my own heart beginning to mend. Margaret was a divorced librarian who lived alone in a farmhouse outside town, volunteering at the animal shelter every weekend. She had this way of seeing hope where others saw hopelessness. What I didn't tell her then What I should have told her from the very beginning was that I recognized her from an old photograph my mother kept on her dresser. Margaret had been my mother's dearest friend 20 years ago, before everything went wrong. 20 years ago, my mother, Betty Mae Johnson, was the finest insurance investigator this side of the Mississippi. She had a nose for fraud that could sniff out a crooked claim from 3 counties away. If the story don't add up, there's usually subtraction going on somewhere, she used to say, tapping her pencil against her notepad while reviewing suspicious files. That autumn of 2004, she'd been working on what she called the big one, a complex insurance fraud scheme that seemed to have tentacles reaching into half the businesses in Cedar Falls. She'd stay up late into the night, spreading documents across our kitchen table, muttering about shell companies and falsified death certificates. The Whitmore family name kept appearing in her notes, circled in red ink with question marks beside it. Margaret was her closest friend then, working as a nurse at the county hospital. They'd have coffee every Tuesday morning at Mabel's Diner, and I remember watching them through the window, 2 women huddled over steaming cups, their voices low and urgent. Margaret would often slip my mother manila envelopes across the checkered tablecloth, medical records she wasn't supposed to have access to. The night before she died, my mother called Margaret from our kitchen phone. I was 22 then, home from veterinary school for the weekend, and I could hear the fear in her voice, even from the next room. "Maggie, if something happens to me, you need to know about the Whitmore files," she whispered into the receiver, thinking I couldn't hear. "I've hidden copies in the old oak tree behind the church. You know, the one where we used to carve our initials as girls. Promise me you'll look if anything goes wrong." Margaret's voice crackled through the receiver, worried and insistent. "Betty Mae, you're scaring me." "What kind of trouble are you in? The kind that kills people. Honey, these folks don't play games. They've got money, connections, and no conscience. If something happens to me, don't trust the official story. And whatever you do, stay away from Harold Whitmore and his sons. They're poison, every last one of them." The next morning, they found my mother's car wrapped around an oak tree on Mill Creek Road. No skid marks, no witnesses, just a woman who'd driven that road 1,000 times suddenly losing control on a clear, dry morning. The sheriff, Harold Whitmore's nephew, ruled it an accident before the coroner had even finished his examination. I knew better. My mother could drive that winding road blindfolded. But grief has a way of making you doubt what you know in your bones. I was young, scared, and devastated. When Margaret came to the funeral, her face pale and eyes red from crying, I couldn't bring myself to ask her about that phone call. Some part of me was terrified of what I might learn. Now, sitting in this hospital waiting room, those memories feel like pieces of a puzzle I was too afraid to put together. After Margaret and I started getting close, I began finding my mother's old files in the attic. Insurance claims that didn't add up, medical records that had been altered, death certificates signed by doctors who'd been paid handsomely for their silence. And right there in the middle of it all was Harold Whitmore, Margaret's ex-husband from her first marriage 25 years ago. The man she'd divorced after 3 miserable years, citing irreconcilable differences when the truth was much darker. I'd seen the faded bruises on her wrists in our early days together, the way she flinched when someone raised their voice unexpectedly, 6 months ago, when Margaret and I announced our engagement. I started noticing things. Cars that seemed to follow her home from the library. Phone calls where nobody spoke when she answered. Duke's behavior changing from friendly protector to constant shadow, never letting her out of his sight. The apple don't fall far from the tree, and some trees are rotten to the core. Harold Whitmore died of a heart attack 3 years back, but his sons Danny and Michael inherited more than just his money. They got his complete lack of moral compass. When word got around town that Margaret was set to inherit her parents' old farm and the mineral rights that came with it, suddenly the Whitmore boys were very interested in their former stepmother. I should have connected the dots sooner. Should have realized that Duke finding Margaret wasn't the accident she thought it was. That German shepherd showed up in her life right around the time the Whitmore family started circling like vultures, and I was too blinded by love to see the pattern. 3 weeks ago, I found a listening device hidden behind the picture frame in Margaret's kitchen, the same frame that held her parents' wedding photo. The next day, someone broke into her house while she was at work, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Duke had been at the groomer's that afternoon, the first time in months he'd been separated from Margaret for more than an hour. When I confronted Margaret about the break-in, she just shrugged it off with that stubborn streak I'd grown to love. "Probably just kids looking for beer money," she said. But I could see the worry lines around her eyes. "Besides, I've got Duke. Nobody's going to mess with a 90-pound German shepherd." But what if Duke wasn't enough? What if the very people who'd killed my mother were now coming for the woman I loved? I started carrying my grandfather's old .38 in my truck, checking Margaret's locks twice every night, insisting on driving her to and from work. "You're being paranoid, Robert," she'd say, laughing at my overprotectiveness. "This is Cedar Falls, not Chicago. The worst crime we've had in years was when Jimmy Patterson stole those lawn gnomes." Margaret didn't know about my mother's investigation, didn't know about the phone call or the hidden files or the connection between the Whitmores and her ex-husband. I told myself I was protecting her by keeping quiet. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from having to relive my mother's death. Looking back now, with Margaret fighting for her life 3 floors above me, I realize my silence might have been the very thing that put her in danger. If I'd told her the truth about the Whitmores from the beginning, would she be wearing a wedding dress right now instead of a hospital gown? The nurses keep walking past with their soft-soled shoes and sympathetic smiles, but I can't shake the feeling that this is far from over. Duke is lying at my feet, his intelligent brown eyes watching every person who passes through these doors. Even now, even here, he's standing guard. My mother always said the truth has a way of surfacing. No matter how deep you try to bury it, I'm starting to think she was right about more things than I ever gave her credit for. "Pastor Williams, I need to confess something that's been weighing on my conscience like a millstone around my neck. I knew Margaret was in danger, and I did nothing to stop it. Worse than that, I kept secrets that might have saved her life. About 6 months after Duke came into our lives, I started noticing things about that dog that didn't add up. Sure, he was smart. German shepherds always are, but Duke was different. He had this way of positioning himself between Margaret and strangers that seemed almost professional, like he'd been trained for it. One evening, I was examining him for his regular checkup when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath the thick fur on his left shoulder was a small, faded tattoo, a series of numbers that looked military. When I researched those numbers, I discovered they belonged to the K-9 unit at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Duke wasn't just some random puppy who'd been hit by a car. He was a retired military working dog. But here's the thing that really got me thinking. Retired military dogs don't just end up wandering Highway 67 in Iowa. They're either adopted by their handlers, placed with veteran families, or put down if they're too damaged for civilian life. How does a perfectly healthy, highly trained German Shepherd end up accidentally found by the one woman in Cedar Falls who might need protection? I started asking around quietly, using my veterinary connections to trace Duke's background. What I found made my hands shake. Duke's last handler was a man named Sergeant Morrison, the same Morrison who happened to be Margaret's family lawyer, the same Morrison who'd been handling her parents' estate and knew about the mineral rights on her property. Hindsight's 20/20, but foresight's worth its weight in gold, and I was blind to what was right in front of me. Samuel Morrison had placed Duke with Margaret deliberately. That accident on Highway 67 was as staged as a church Christmas pageant. When I finally worked up the courage to confront Morrison at his law office, the old man didn't even try to deny it. He was in his 70s, with hands that shook from Parkinson's, but eyes that were still sharp as a tack. "Your mother was my partner in more ways than one. Robert," he said, pulling out a bottle of bourbon and pouring 2 glasses despite the early hour. "We both knew the Whitmores were dirty, and we both knew they'd killed to keep their secrets. When Betty May died, I made a promise to look after the people she cared about." Morrison had been investigating the Whitmore family for nearly 2 decades, building a case that could bring down their entire operation. But he needed proof, the kind of proof that got people killed if they got too close. That's where my mother came in, with her insurance investigator credentials and her access to financial records. "Margaret doesn't know any of this," Morrison continued, his voice heavy with the weight of old secrets. "And it needs to stay that way until we can put Harold's boys behind bars where they belong. Sometimes the shepherd needs a shepherd, if you catch my meaning." I wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at him for manipulating Margaret's life without her knowledge, but looking at the thick files spread across his desk, photographs, financial records, testimony from victims who'd been too scared to speak up for years, I realized Morrison was fighting a war that my mother had died for. "Why, Duke?" I asked. "Why not just tell her the truth?" Morrison's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You ever try to tell Margaret Johnson she needs protecting? That woman's got more stubborn pride than a mule in mud. She'd have run straight at the Whitmores just to prove she wasn't afraid. This way, she's got protection she doesn't know she needs." Duke wasn't just a pet. He was a 4-legged bodyguard who'd been trained to detect drugs, explosives, and most importantly for Margaret's situation, poisons. His nose could identify chemical compounds that would take a laboratory hours to analyze. Morrison had specifically requested a dog with that particular skill set. "The Whitmores are getting desperate," Morrison warned me. "Margaret's parents' will goes to probate next month, and if she inherits that land, she'll own the richest shale oil deposit in 3 counties. Danny and Michael Whitmore have been counting on that mineral money to pay off some very dangerous people. They're not going to let a librarian stand between them and financial survival." That's when Morrison told me about the threatening letters Margaret had been receiving. Letters she'd never mentioned to me. Anonymous notes telling her to reconsider her living arrangements and think about her future carefully. The Duke had been intercepting some of them, bringing them to Morrison instead of Margaret. I felt sick to my stomach. How many other things had been happening right under my nose while I was walking around like a lovesick fool, planning our wedding and dreaming about our future together. She's been getting strange phone calls, too. Morrison continued. Hang-ups mostly, but a few with voices telling her she'd be better off leaving town. Duke's been trained to bark in a specific pattern when he detects surveillance equipment. Has he been doing that lately around Margaret's house? My heart sank as I remembered all the times Duke had barked in that odd, rhythmic way. 3 short barks, pause, 2 long ones, pause, repeat. I'd thought he was just being territorial about squirrels or the mailman. They've been watching her for months, I whispered, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. The listening devices, the break-ins, the cars following her home. They've been planning this. Morrison nodded grimly. The Whitmore boys learned from their father's mistakes. They're not going to make it look like an accident this time. Too many people are watching now, asking questions about the old man's business dealings. They need something that looks natural, unavoidable. That's when he told me about Margaret's medical history, specifically her epilepsy, a condition that could explain sudden death, especially if the right drugs were involved. Drugs that would be nearly impossible to detect in a standard autopsy, but that Duke's trained nose could identify long before they became fatal. She's been exhibiting symptoms lately, Morrison said, and my blood turned to ice water. Dizziness, confusion, changes in appetite. Duke's been more agitated than usual, hasn't he? Following her everywhere, refusing to let her eat or drink anything he hasn't sniffed first. I thought about the past few weeks, about how Margaret had been complaining of headaches and nausea, how she'd joked about wedding nerves making her feel sick, how Duke had been knocking food out of her hands or blocking her path to the kitchen at odd times. Sweet Jesus, I breathed. They're already poisoning her. Morrison's face was grim as a funeral director's. Slow-acting compounds that mimic epileptic episodes. By the time the symptoms are obvious, it's usually too late. Duke's been trying to tell us, but we haven't been listening to what he's really saying. I left Morrison's office that day with a terrible choice ahead of me. Tell Margaret the truth and risk sending her into a panic that might make her do something dangerous, or keep quiet, and hope that Duke's protection would be enough until we could gather evidence to stop the Whitmores permanently. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones where every choice feels wrong. I chose silence. And now my Margaret is fighting for her life because I was too much of a coward to trust her with the truth. The day everything changed was a Thursday in October, exactly 1 week before our wedding. I remember because Margaret had taken the afternoon off from the library to finalize the flower arrangements, and I was supposed to meet her at Peterson's florist at 3 o'clock. Instead, I found myself sitting in Samuel Morrison's law office again, staring at surveillance photographs that made my stomach turn. These were taken yesterday outside Margaret's house, Morrison said, sliding the black and white images across his mahogany desk. The photos showed a man in a baseball cap tampering with Margaret's mailbox, another crouched near her kitchen window, and a third figure I recognized with a sick jolt of recognition. "That's Patricia," I whispered, pointing to a woman in a dark coat standing at the edge of Margaret's property. "Margaret's sister, Patricia." Morrison's weathered face showed no surprise. "We've been watching her for 3 weeks now. She's been making regular visits to the Whitmore boys, always after dark, always carrying a small bag." Duke's been going crazy every time she comes around Margaret's place. Haven't you noticed?" I had noticed. Actually, Duke's behavior around Patricia had become increasingly agitated over the past month. He'd growl low in his throat whenever she visited, position himself between her and Margaret, and refuse to let Patricia near the kitchen when Margaret was cooking. I'd chalked it up to normal dog territorial behavior. But now, "Patricia's in debt up to her eyeballs," Morrison continued, pulling out another file thick with financial records. "Gambling addiction, 3 failed marriages, and about $50,000 owed to some very unforgiving people in Chicago. The Whitmores offered her a way out, help them with Margaret, and they'd clear her debts and throw in $20,000 cash." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had been Margaret's maid of honor, had helped her pick out the wedding dress, had been staying at Margaret's house all week to help with wedding preparations. Sweet, scattered Patricia, who always seemed to be struggling financially, but whom Margaret supported without question because family takes care of family. "How?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would break my heart. Morrison opened a small evidence bag and showed me a vial of clear liquid. "Synthetic compound that mimics the effects of severe epileptic seizure, odorless, tasteless, and nearly impossible to detect unless you know exactly what to look for. Patricia's been putting small amounts in Margaret's coffee every morning for the past 2 weeks, building up the concentration slowly." My hands clenched into fists. "That's why Margaret's been feeling sick. The headaches, the dizziness, the confusion. We thought it was wedding stress. The beauty of this particular poison is that it creates symptoms that can be explained away as pre-existing medical conditions," Morrison explained grimly. "Margaret's epilepsy makes her the perfect victim. When she finally succumbs, it'll look like a tragic but natural progression of her disease. No investigation, no questions, just a very sad funeral." I thought about Duke's increasingly frantic behavior over the past weeks, how he'd started knocking Margaret's coffee cup out of her hands every morning, earning scolding from both of us for being naughty, how he'd begun following her to the bathroom, the bedroom, everywhere she went, as if he couldn't bear to let her out of his sight. "Duke's been trying to save her this whole time," I said, the realization hitting me like a sledgehammer. Every time he knocked over her coffee, every time he acted up around Patricia, he was trying to tell us. Morrison nodded. "Military working dogs are trained to detect chemical weapons and biological threats. Duke's nose is sensitive enough to identify parts per million of toxic substances. He's been screaming warnings that we've been too human to understand." The old lawyer pulled out his phone and showed me a text message, time-stamped from earlier that morning. "It's happening today. P says she can't wait any longer. The Chicago people are getting impatient. Make sure you're ready to move fast on the probate." My blood turned to ice. "Today Margaret's supposed to be at the florist right now." Morrison was already reaching for his coat. "Patricia volunteered to make Margaret lunch before the appointment. Said she wanted to do something special for her sister before the big day." We raced across town in Morrison's old Buick, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I kept trying to call Margaret's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail every time. The florist shop was only 10 minutes from Margaret's house, but those 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. When we pulled into Margaret's driveway, Patricia's car was still there, but everything looked normal from the outside. Too normal. No sound of Duke barking, no movement in the windows, just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Morrison had his hand on his service weapon. I hadn't known the old lawyer still carried one until that moment. "Stay behind me," he instructed as we approached the front door. "If this goes sideways, call 911 and get out." The front door was unlocked, which immediately set off alarm bells. Margaret never left her door unlocked. Not even when she was home. We crept through the living room, following the sound of voices from the kitchen. "Just need you to drink all of it, Maggie," Patricia was saying in a voice I'd never heard before. Cold, calculating, desperate. "It'll help with the wedding nerves, I promise. It's just herbal tea, like Mama used to make." "I don't understand why Duke's acting this way." Margaret's voice sounded slurred, confused. "He keeps trying to knock the cup away from me. Maybe he's sick." Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Duke pacing frantically around Margaret's chair, whining and pawing at her arm. Margaret was holding a steaming mug, her movements slow and uncoordinated. Patricia stood behind her, one hand on Margaret's shoulder in what would have looked like sisterly affection to anyone who didn't know better. "Duke's just excited about the wedding," Patricia said smoothly. "Dogs can sense when their owners are stressed. Now drink up, sweetie. You'll feel better in a few minutes." Morrison stepped into the kitchen doorway, his weapon drawn but held low. "Step away from your sister." "Patricia." Patricia's face went white, then red with fury. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I don't have a choice here." "These people will kill me if I don't pay them back. Margaret's going to die anyway. The Whitmores will make sure of that. At least this way it's quick, painless." Margaret tried to stand but stumbled, catching herself on the kitchen table. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor, Duke immediately lapping up the spilled liquid before Morrison could stop him. "No!" I shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. Duke had ingested enough of the poisoned tea to kill a horse. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my days. Duke looked up at me with those intelligent brown eyes, his tail wagging weakly, and then collapsed onto the kitchen floor. He'd saved Margaret's life by drinking the poison meant for her, and we all knew he was dying. Margaret sobbed over Duke's still form while Morrison handcuffed Patricia, who had gone completely silent, except for mechanical repetitions of, "I didn't have a choice, I didn't have a choice." The paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do for Duke. The concentration of poison in that tea was designed to be fatal, and his smaller body mass meant it worked even faster. Margaret held his head in her lap as his breathing grew shallow, whispering apologies and love words while tears streamed down both our faces. Duke died protecting the woman who had saved him 3 years earlier, and in doing so, he exposed the conspiracy that would have destroyed everything we held dear. "Sometimes the shepherd needs a shepherd," Morrison had said. But it turned out our shepherd was the bravest soul any of us had ever known. "Pastor Williams, I need to stop here for a moment because what I'm about to tell you defies everything I thought I knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways that love works in this world. You see, Duke didn't die that day in Margaret's kitchen. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle wrapped in the most terrifying 48 hours of my life. After Duke collapsed from the poisoned tea, I was certain we'd lost him. The paramedics couldn't find a pulse. His breathing had stopped, and his body had gone completely limp. Margaret was inconsolable, cradling his still form while Patricia sat handcuffed in the corner, muttering her desperate mantra about having no choice. But as the paramedics were preparing to take Margaret to the hospital for her own poisoning symptoms, something extraordinary happened. Duke's eyes fluttered open, and he let out the weakest whine I'd ever heard from any animal. It was barely audible, but Margaret heard it. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice breaking with hope and disbelief. "Robert, he's still alive." The emergency veterinarian we rushed Duke to later explained that German Shepherds have a unique metabolism that can sometimes process certain toxins differently than other breeds. Combined with Duke's military conditioning and the fact that he'd only ingested the tea for a few seconds before we intervened, he had just enough fight left in him to survive what should have been a lethal dose. But barely surviving wasn't the same as being safe. Duke spent the next 2 days in intensive care while Margaret recovered from her own poisoning symptoms in the human hospital across town. I found myself running between 2 buildings, checking on both of the souls I loved most in this world, while Morrison coordinated with law enforcement to unravel the full scope of the Whitmore conspiracy. The timing couldn't have been worse. Our wedding was supposed to be in 3 days, and instead of finalizing seating charts and rehearsing vows, we were dealing with attempted murder charges and a federal investigation that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. On Friday morning, 48 hours before our scheduled ceremony, Morrison came to the hospital with news that made my blood run cold. "The Whitmore boys have disappeared," he said, his weathered face grim as a storm cloud. "FBI went to arrest them yesterday evening, but their house was empty. Neighbors say they saw moving trucks there on Wednesday night." Margaret, still weak but increasingly alert, gripped my hand from her hospital bed. "What does that mean for us, for Duke?" "It means they're desperate enough to run, which makes them dangerous enough to come back," Morrison replied. "Patricia's singing like a canary now that she's facing federal charges, but Danny and Michael Whitmore have too much to lose to just disappear quietly. They'll try to finish what they started." The next piece of information Morrison shared hit me like a physical blow. "We found evidence that this wasn't their first attempt. Someone's been tampering with Margaret's car brakes, her prescription medications, even her work coffee pot at the library. Duke's been the only thing standing between Margaret and a dozen different ways they've tried to kill her over the past 6 months." Margaret's face went pale as she processed this information. "The day my brakes failed on Mill Creek Road, that wasn't an accident. Same road where your mother died." "Robert," Morrison said quietly. "Same curve, same modus operandi. The Whitmores have been using that stretch of road for their accidents for 20 years. The weight of how close we'd come to losing Margaret, not just once, but repeatedly, settled over us like a suffocating blanket. Every time Duke had acted strangely, every moment of protective behavior we'd dismissed as normal dog instincts had been him literally saving her life. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly. Our wedding day transformed into something unrecognizable from the joyous celebration we'd planned. Margaret was being discharged from the hospital, but Duke was still critical. The veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been honest about his chances. "The next 24 hours will tell us everything," she explained as we stood around Duke's kennel in the ICU. "His liver function is improving, but there could be permanent neurological damage. Even if he recovers physically, he might not be the same dog mentally." Margaret knelt beside the kennel, pressing her face against the wire mesh. Duke's eyes were open, but he seemed to look through her, rather than at her. "Hey, boy," she whispered. "It's your mama. You saved me again, didn't you, just like you've been doing all along?" As if responding to her voice, Duke's tail gave the faintest twitch, It was barely movement, but it was something. That's when Morrison received the phone call that changed everything. His face went white as he listened to whoever was on the other end, and when he hung up, his hands were shaking. They found Danny Whitmore's body in a hotel room in Kansas City, he said quietly. Apparent suicide, with a note confessing to multiple murders, including his father's victims from 20 years ago. Michael's still in the wind, but his credit cards were used in Mexico this morning. Margaret and I looked at each other, trying to process this development. "Is it over?" she asked. "Are we safe now?" Morrison's expression was troubled. Danny was the mastermind, but Michael's always been the more violent of the two brothers. A cornered animal is dangerous, and a cornered Whitmore with nothing left to lose. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The hospital security team had been quietly increased over the past 2 days, but Morrison insisted on hiring private protection for both Margaret and Duke. "Until we have Michael in custody, you're both still targets," he explained. "Dead men can't testify, and Duke's the only witness who can identify the poison compounds they've been using." That afternoon, as Margaret and I sat in Duke's recovery room watching for any signs of improvement, she finally asked the question I'd been dreading. "How long have you known?" Her voice was quiet, without accusation, but loaded with pain. "About the Whitmores, about Duke being placed with me, about all of it." I couldn't lie to her anymore. "Morrison told me about Duke's background 6 months ago, about the poisoning attempts, 3 weeks ago, about Patricia." My voice broke. "I found out the day before yesterday. Same as you." Margaret was quiet for a long time, absently stroking Duke's paw through the kennel wire. When she finally spoke, her words surprised me. "I'm not angry about you keeping the Duke secret," she said. "I understand why Morrison thought it was necessary, but I am hurt that you didn't trust me enough to handle the truth about the danger I was in." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. Margaret talked about feeling infantilized, about being surrounded by men who thought they knew what was best for her without consulting her wishes. I tried to explain about my fear of losing her like I'd lost my mother, about the paralyzing terror that had kept me silent. "Your mother was my best friend," Margaret said finally. "Did you know she wanted me to look after you if anything happened to her? That last phone call wasn't just about the Whitmore files. She asked me to promise I'd find you someday, make sure you were okay." The pieces clicked together in my mind with stunning clarity. "That's why you brought Duke to my clinic specifically. You could have taken him to the animal hospital on the other side of town, but you came to me." Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "I'd been working up the courage to contact you for months, trying to figure out how to honor that promise to your mother. When I found Duke on Highway 67, it seemed like Providence giving me an excuse." Just then, Duke lifted his head and looked directly at Margaret with clear, focused eyes. His tail began to wag weakly, and he made a soft, whining sound that was pure recognition and love. "Welcome back, boy," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We missed you." As Duke's recovery progressed over the next few hours, I realized that our wedding might be postponed, our plans completely disrupted, and our future uncertain with Michael Whitmore still at large. But we were alive, we were together, and we had Duke back. Sometimes that's all the miracle you need to keep going. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes you believe in new beginnings, but the atmosphere in Cedar Falls was anything but peaceful. Our wedding day had become a strange vigil, split between Duke's recovery room and the heightened security that now surrounded our lives like an invisible cage. Margaret had insisted on spending the night at the veterinary clinic, sleeping in a chair beside Duke's kennel despite my protests and Dr. Chen's concerns about her own recovery. When I arrived at 6 a.m. with coffee and fresh clothes, I found her already awake, watching Duke with the intense focus of a mother guarding her child. "He's been restless all night," she said, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. "Not in pain, just alert, like he's listening for something." Duke was indeed different than he'd been the previous day. While his physical recovery continued to amaze Dr. Chen, there was something in his demeanor that set my nerves on edge. His ears were constantly pricked forward, his head turning toward every sound from the parking lot, and occasionally he would let out a low growl at absolutely nothing we could identify. Dogs often have heightened senses after trauma, Dr. Chen explained when I mentioned my concerns. He might be hearing things that seem threatening but are perfectly normal. His system is still processing the toxins. But I knew Duke well enough by now to recognize the difference between medical disorientation and genuine alarm. This was the same focused alertness he'd shown in the weeks leading up to Margaret's poisoning, the behavior of a highly trained protection dog sensing imminent danger. Morrison arrived at 8 o'clock with news that confirmed my worst fears. "Michael Whitmore never made it to Mexico," he said grimly. "The credit card transactions were decoys. He had someone else using his cards while he doubled back. Local police found his truck abandoned about 30 miles north of here." Margaret's face went pale. How close is 30 miles when you're talking about a desperate man with nothing left to lose? "Close enough," Morrison replied. "I've got federal marshals positioning around the clinic and your house. But Michael knows this area better than they do. He grew up here, knows every back road and hiding spot in 3 counties. That's when Duke began to bark. Not his usual protective bark, but the specific pattern Morrison had told me about weeks earlier. 3 short barks. Pause, 2 long ones, pause, repeat. The surveillance warning. Dr. Chen looked puzzled. "I don't see anyone in the parking lot. Maybe he's reacting to the security team." But Morrison was already on his radio, his face tense with concentration. "Eagle Eye, this is base. Confirm your positions." "Roger that. Charlie Unit. Do you have eyes on the north approach?" The radio crackled with static and urgent voices. One of the marshals reported movement in the tree line behind the clinic, someone with binoculars watching the building. Another confirmed that Michael Whitmore's photograph had been spotted at a gas station just 10 miles away, asking questions about the veterinary clinic. "He's coming for Duke," Margaret said with sudden, terrible clarity. "Duke's the only witness who can identify the poison compounds. If Michael eliminates him, there's no physical evidence linking the Whitmores to the murders." Morrison nodded grimly. "Smart girl. Without Duke's testimony, and yes, trained dogs can testify in federal court, the case against the Whitmore organization falls apart. Michael kills Duke, disappears again, and in a few years he's back in business." The next hour passed in agonizing tension. Duke remained on high alert, his warning barks becoming more frequent and urgent. The federal marshals reported multiple sightings of suspicious vehicles in the area, but Michael Whitmore seemed to stay just ahead of their perimeter, watching and waiting for his opportunity. Margaret refused to leave Duke's side, despite increasingly urgent suggestions from law enforcement that she relocate to a secure facility. "I'm not abandoning him again," she said with the stubborn determination I'd fallen in love with. "He saved my life a dozen times over. I'm not running when he needs me." At 10:30, Duke's barking suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. He stood perfectly still in his kennel, every muscle tense, his eyes fixed on the clinic's back entrance. The hair along his spine was raised in a ridge of pure aggression. "He's here," Margaret whispered. "Michael's here." Morrison was coordinating with his team through hand signals now, everyone moving with the careful precision of professionals who knew that one mistake could cost lives. Dr. Chen had locked down the clinic, but we all knew that a determined man with weapons could overcome any civilian security measures. The power went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made shadows dance in corners where no shadows should be. Duke began to growl, a low, continuous sound that raised the hair on my arms and reminded me that beneath his gentle nature lay the instincts of a predator. "Backup generator's been cut," Morrison reported tersely. "He's trying to isolate us, limit our communication options." That's when we heard the sound that made my blood freeze, the metallic scrape of someone forcing the back door. Michael Whitmore had found his way inside. Dr. Chen grabbed her emergency medical kit and positioned herself behind the reception desk. Morrison drew his weapon and motioned for Margaret and me to get down behind Duke's kennel. The federal marshals were moving to converge on the building, but they were still minutes away from breaching the entrances, minutes we might not have. Duke was pacing now in his small kennel, his movements growing more agitated with each passing second. He looked at Margaret with what I could only describe as desperate communication. He wanted out, wanted to protect her, but was trapped behind the wire mesh that had been keeping him safe. "Let him out," Margaret said suddenly. "Absolutely not," Morrison and I said in unison. "He's still recovering from poisoning," Dr. Chen added. "The stress alone could kill him." But Margaret was already reaching for the kennel latch. "Duke knows this building better than any of us. He knows Michael's scent from all those surveillance photos Morrison showed us. And right now, he's our best early warning system." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made the decision for us. Heavy boots, moving with purpose toward the treatment rooms where we were hiding. Michael Whitmore had found us. Duke practically exploded from his kennel the moment Margaret opened the latch. Despite his recent trauma, he moved with all the grace and power of his military training, positioning himself between us and the hallway door. His growl deepened to a sound I'd never heard from him before. Pure, focused aggression. "Margaret Johnson," a voice called from the hallway. Michael Whitmore's voice, calm and conversational despite the circumstances. "I know you're in there. This doesn't have to be complicated. Just give me the dog and walk away." Margaret's jaw set with the same determination she'd shown when saving Duke 3 years earlier. "Go to hell. Michael." His laugh was cold as winter wind. "Your sister said you'd be difficult. Patricia always claimed you were too stubborn for your own good. Look how that worked out for her." The cruelty in his voice, the casual way he referenced Patricia's betrayal, lit a fire in Margaret's eyes that I'd never seen before. She was no longer the gentle librarian who rescued wounded animals. She was a woman protecting her family. And that made her dangerous. "You killed your own father," she called back. "Your own brother. What makes you think I'd trust anything you say? Harold was weak, and Danny was stupid," Michael replied. "But I'm neither. I'm offering you a clean trade. Your life for the dogs. Simple business transaction." That's when Duke made his move. Without warning, he bolted toward the hallway door, moving faster than any of us could react. Morrison shouted for him to stop. Margaret screamed his name. But Duke was operating on pure instinct now, the instinct to eliminate a threat to his pack. The gunshots that followed echoed through the clinic like thunder, one after another in rapid succession. Duke's bark turned to a yelp of pain, then silence. Margaret was on her feet and moving before I could stop her. Despite Morrison's desperate attempts to hold her back, she burst through the hallway door calling Duke's name, and I followed her into what I was certain would be our final moments. What we found in that hallway defied every expectation. Michael Whitmore was on the ground, his weapon several feet away, clutching a shoulder that was bleeding heavily. Duke stood over him, wounded but victorious, his teeth bared in a snarl that promised death if Michael so much as twitched. The federal marshals burst through the front entrance at that moment, weapons drawn, shouting commands that weren't necessary. Duke had done their job for them. "Lord giveth and Lord taketh away," but this don't feel like the Lord's work, I thought as we watched the paramedics tend to both Duke's bullet wound and Michael's injuries. This felt like justice, served by the most unlikely hero any of us could have imagined. The silence that followed the gunshots was broken only by the sound of sirens growing closer, and Michael Whitmore's labored breathing. Duke remained standing over his subdued attacker, blood seeping from a graze on his left flank, but his eyes never left Michael's face, even wounded. Our guardian was still on duty. Margaret knelt beside Duke, her hands trembling as she examined his injury. "It's just a flesh wound," Dr. Chen confirmed, arriving with her medical bag. "The bullet caught his hindquarter, but it's superficial. He'll be fine." But as the federal marshals handcuffed Michael and read him his rights, I noticed something in the wounded man's eyes that made my skin crawl. Despite being caught, despite facing life in prison, Michael Whitmore was smiling. "You think this is over," he said, his voice weak but filled with venom. "You think catching me ends anything? My family's been in this business for 40 years. We've got connections you people can't even imagine." Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face hard as granite. "Your connections are about to become federal evidence. Son, Patricia's been very helpful in that regard." Michael's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed malice. "Patricia doesn't know half of what she thinks she knows. And what she doesn't know is that this was never just about Margaret's inheritance." The paramedics were loading Michael onto a stretcher, but he kept talking, his words carrying the weight of terrible revelations. "You want to know why we really wanted Margaret dead? It wasn't just the mineral rights on her parents' land. It was what she witnessed 20 years ago." Margaret's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The night Betty Mae Johnson died," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You were there, Margaret. You saw the whole thing. You just don't remember because of the trauma." Morrison grabbed Michael's shoulder, his knuckles white with tension. "That's enough. You're under arrest. Anything you say." She was coming home from her nursing shift at the hospital. Michael interrupted, his eyes locked on Margaret's horrified face. She saw my father and Uncle Harold forcing Betty May's car off the road. She saw them stage the accident, and she saw them notice her watching from the woods. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the implications hit me. If Margaret had witnessed my mother's murder, if she'd been a threat to the Whitmores for 20 years, that's why they let her live back then. Michael went on, seemingly oblivious to the federal marshals trying to silence him. She was just a kid, traumatized, in shock. They figured she'd never remember clearly enough to be a threat. But when she started dating Robert, when she started asking questions about Betty May's investigation, they realized she might recover those memories. Morrison finished, his voice hollow with understanding. Especially with the right triggers, old files, familiar names, stress from the approaching wedding. Margaret sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "I've been having nightmares," she whispered. "The same dream over and over. A car wreck in the rain, men in dark coats, someone screaming my name. Your subconscious trying to break through the trauma block," Dr. Chen said gently. "It's not uncommon for buried memories to surface during times of emotional stress." As the paramedics wheeled Michael away, he managed one final, chilling statement. "She's going to remember everything now, and when she does, she'll realize there were 3 cars that night, not 2. She'll remember who else was involved." The federal marshals followed the ambulance out, leaving us in the eerily quiet clinic with Duke, who had finally allowed Dr. Chen to properly examine his wound. But Michael's words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, threatening everything we thought we understood about the past 20 years. Morrison was on his phone immediately, calling his contacts at the FBI. "We need a full psychiatric evaluation for Margaret," I heard him saying. "Trauma recovery specialist, memory reconstruction therapy, the works. If she witnessed Betty May's murder, her testimony could break this whole conspiracy wide open." But Margaret wasn't listening to Morrison's plans. She was staring into space, her eyes unfocused, as if she was watching scenes that only she could see. "There were 3 cars," she said quietly. "Michael's right. I remember now. There was my father's old pickup truck. I'd borrowed it to drive home from work because my car was in the shop. There was your mother's sedan, and there was a 3rd vehicle, something dark and expensive." Her voice grew stronger as the memories surfaced. "I was taking the back way home to avoid the main roads. It was raining so hard that night. I saw headlights ahead. Cars stopped at odd angles. I pulled over and got out to see if anyone needed help." Margaret's hands were shaking now, but she continued. "Your mother was already dead when I got there. 2 men were arranging her body in the driver's seat, making it look like she'd lost control and hit the tree. They were arguing about something, about whether the scene looked convincing." "Did you recognize them?" Morrison asked gently. "Harold Whitmore and another man, older, with gray hair and an expensive suit. The older man was giving orders, telling Harold this had to look perfect or they'd all go down. He kept saying something about the Chicago people and how they couldn't afford any loose ends." Morrison's face had gone ashen. "Margaret, that older man, can you describe him in more detail? Tall, distinguished-looking, with a gold watch and a ring with some kind of crest. He spoke with authority, like he was used to being obeyed. Harold was clearly afraid of him." Morrison pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a photograph. "Is this the man?" Margaret's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. "That's him." "Who is he?" "Federal Judge William Morrison." Morrison said quietly, "My own uncle. The man who's been protecting the Whitmore family from prosecution for 2 decades. The revelation hit us like a physical blow. Morrison's own family had been part of the conspiracy that killed my mother and tried to kill Margaret. The very system we'd trusted to deliver justice had been corrupted from the top down. That's why the investigation into Betty May's death was shut down so quickly." Morrison continued, his voice heavy with disgust and grief. "Why the evidence disappeared. Why witnesses were discredited. My uncle made sure the case never went anywhere." Margaret stood up suddenly, her face pale but determined. "I have to testify. I have to tell what I saw that night." "Margaret," I said carefully, "testifying against a federal judge, even a corrupt one, is dangerous. These people have killed to protect their secrets before. And they'll keep killing until someone stops them," she replied with the stubborn courage I'd come to love. "Your mother died trying to expose the truth. I won't let her sacrifice be meaningless." Duke limped over to Margaret's side, his protective instincts still intact despite his injuries. As she knelt to pet him, he looked up at her with what I could only describe as approval, as if he understood the weight of her decision and supported it completely. "There's something else," Margaret said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I remember the older man saying something about other witnesses, other people who needed to be handled. He mentioned a list of names, people who might cause problems. Morrison leaned forward intently. "Do you remember any of the names?" "One of them was Patricia," Margaret said, and my blood ran cold. "He said Patricia Johnson was getting too close to the truth and might need to be eliminated if she couldn't be bought." The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Patricia's gambling debts, her desperation, her willingness to poison her own sister. It hadn't been greed driving her. It had been terror. The Whitmores hadn't just offered her money. They'd threatened her life. "They've been manipulating Patricia for years," Margaret realized. "Using her debts as leverage, threatening to kill her if she didn't cooperate. When they decided I was becoming too dangerous, they forced her to be their weapon." Dr. Chen, who had been quietly tending to Duke throughout these revelations, spoke up unexpectedly. "If Patricia was being coerced, that changes everything legally. She might be willing to testify against the larger conspiracy in exchange for protection." Morrison was already working his phone again, coordinating with federal prosecutors who were rapidly realizing that what they'd thought was a simple murder for inheritance case was actually the tip of an iceberg involving judicial corruption, organized crime, and decades of cover-ups. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret's recovered memories continued to surface in fragments. She remembered license plate numbers, conversations she'd overheard, physical evidence that had been planted or removed from the scene. Each detail added another piece to a puzzle that painted a picture of corruption reaching far beyond Cedar Falls. But perhaps the most important memory was the last one that came back to her. "After I saw what happened to your mother," she told me, her eyes bright with tears, "I ran back to my truck and drove home in terror. I never told anyone what I'd seen because I was afraid they'd kill me too. But the next morning, someone had left a note on my windshield." "What did it say?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Forget what you think you saw, or you'll join your friend." But there was something else attached to it, a photograph of me taken through my bedroom window while I was sleeping. They wanted me to know they could reach me any time. The psychological warfare had been perfect. Keep Margaret terrified but alive, monitor her for 20 years, and only move to eliminate her when she became an active threat. It was a level of calculated cruelty that made my skin crawl. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the bond between Margaret and Duke, and they'd never anticipated that a trained military dog would be smart enough to detect their poison plot and brave enough to stop it. As Duke rested his head on Margaret's lap, his wound properly bandaged and his duty finally complete, I realized that justice sometimes comes in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes it comes on 4 legs, with a wet nose and a heart full of loyalty that no amount of human corruption can break. 6 months later, I am standing in the same church where Margaret and I were supposed to be married on that terrible October day. But everything is different now. The afternoon sun streams through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews filled with friends, family, and half the population of Cedar Falls. This time, there are no federal marshals hidden in the congregation, no fear lurking in the shadows, and no secrets between Margaret and me. Duke sits proudly at the altar wearing a bow tie that matches my own, his German Shepherd dignity intact despite the formal wear. The bullet graze on his flank has healed completely, leaving only a small scar that Margaret calls his Medal of Honor. Dr. Chen declared him fully recovered 3 months ago, though she admits his protective instincts have become even more finely tuned since the incident. Margaret walks down the aisle in the same ivory dress she wore in that coffin 6 months ago. But now it represents triumph instead of tragedy. Her sister Patricia sits in the front row, thin and fragile from her time in federal custody, but present at Margaret's insistence. The road to forgiveness has been long and difficult, but Margaret's capacity for grace continues to amaze everyone who knows her. Family doesn't abandon family. Margaret had told me when she decided to support Patricia through her cooperation with federal prosecutors. Patricia made terrible choices, but they were made under terrible circumstances. Healing starts with understanding. Patricia's testimony proved crucial in bringing down what the FBI now calls the Cedar Falls conspiracy. Federal Judge William Morrison, Samuel Morrison's uncle, was arrested 3 months ago on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and judicial corruption spanning 2 decades. The evidence Margaret's recovered memories provided was devastating, but Patricia's insider knowledge of the Whitmore organization's operations sealed the case. The trial made national news, not just for the scope of the corruption, but for the remarkable story of Duke's heroism. CNN ran a feature called "The German Shepherd Who Saved Justice," and Duke received commendations from the American Kennel Club, the Military Canine Corps, and the governor of Iowa. More importantly to Margaret and me, he received a lifetime supply of his favorite treats from every pet store in 3 counties. As Pastor Williams begins the ceremony, I catch Margaret's eye and see the same mix of love, determination, and quiet strength that first drew me to her 3 years ago. But there's something new there, too. A depth that comes from surviving the worst that life can throw at you and choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Dearly beloved, Pastor Williams begins, his voice carrying the weight of everything this community has been through together. We are gathered here today not just to witness the union of Robert and Margaret, but to celebrate the triumph of truth, loyalty, and love over the forces that would destroy them. The ceremony is simple but perfect. Margaret and I exchange vows we wrote ourselves, promising not just to love each other in good times and bad, but to trust each other with the truth, to face our fears together, and to never let secrets come between us again. When it comes time for the rings, Duke performs his role as ring-bearer with the dignity befitting a war hero. Though his tail wagging threatens to knock over the flower arrangements, Samuel Morrison serves as my best man, his weathered face showing both joy and the lingering sadness of his uncle's betrayal. He's retiring from law practice next month, but not before establishing a foundation in my mother's name to help other families find justice when the system fails them. Betty May would be so proud, he whispers to me as we watch Margaret approach the altar. She always said love would win in the end, even when it looked impossible. Dr. Chen sits with her husband in the third row, beaming with pride at Duke's full recovery and their own engagement announcement last month. The trauma of those terrible days brought our small community closer together in ways none of us expected. When people face evil together and survive, the bonds formed are unbreakable. After we're pronounced husband and wife, Margaret and I walk back down the aisle together with Duke trotting proudly beside us. Outside the church, the entire town seems to be waiting with rice, confetti, and enough well wishes to last a lifetime. "You know what they say," calls out Mabel from the diner, her voice carrying over the celebration. "The darkest hour is just before the dawn. Y'all found your sunrise." The reception is held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with autumn flowers and photographs documenting our journey from that first day at the veterinary clinic to this moment. One table displays newspaper clippings about the trial, Duke's Heroism Awards, and letters of support from around the country. But my favorite display is the simple photo of Duke as a wounded puppy in Margaret's arms, labeled "Where It All Began." During the dinner, Patricia approaches the head table nervously. She's lost weight during her ordeal, and her hands shake slightly from the medication she takes for anxiety. But her eyes are clear in a way they haven't been for years. "Margaret," she says quietly, "I know words can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that testifying against the conspiracy was the first truly free choice I've made in 20 years. They owned me through my debts and my fear, but watching you forgive me, that gave me the strength to tell the truth." Margaret stands and embraces her sister, both women crying openly. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Margaret says, echoing the words she's used throughout Patricia's recovery. "But it means freeing your own heart from the poison of hate." The evening's most touching moment comes when Samuel Morrison stands to give a toast. His voice is strong despite his age, carrying the authority of a man who spent his life fighting for justice. 40 years ago, I made a promise to a young woman named Betty Mae Johnson that I would always stand for truth, no matter how difficult or dangerous that might be. 20 years ago, I failed her when she needed me most, too caught up in my own family's corruption to see the danger she faced. He raises his glass toward Margaret and me. But today, I've seen that promise fulfilled in ways I never could have imagined. A woman who chose courage over safety, a man who chose love over silence, and a dog who chose duty over his own survival. They've shown us that justice isn't just about laws and courts. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when it matters most. As the evening winds down, Margaret and I step outside for a moment of quiet. Duke follows us, as he always does, positioning himself where he can watch both the door and the parking lot. Some habits die hard, and we've learned to appreciate his vigilance rather than take it for granted. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found Duke that day? I ask, wrapping my arms around my wife. Margaret leans back against me, her hand reaching down to stroke Duke's head. I think about it all the time. But then I remember what your mother used to say. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, but he always gets where he's going. Maybe Duke finding me was part of a plan that started long before either of us was born. 3 months after the wedding, Margaret and I received news that brought the story full circle. The FBI's investigation into the Cedar Falls conspiracy led to the discovery of corruption in several other jurisdictions, resulting in dozens of arrests and the exoneration of families who'd been denied justice for decades. One of those families was the Johnsons, no relation to Margaret, whose father had been murdered 15 years ago in a case that was covered up by the same network that killed my mother. Patricia completed her cooperation agreement and was sentenced to community service and probation. She's working now as a counselor for other people struggling with gambling addiction, using her experience to help others break free from the cycle of debt and desperation that nearly destroyed her life. Federal Judge William Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. At 78 years old, it's effectively a life sentence. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse, maintaining that he was simply protecting important business interests. Some people never learn that there are things more important than money and power. Michael Whitmore pled guilty to attempted murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges in exchange for life without parole. His cooperation helped federal investigators identify other corrupt officials in the network, though we were told his information was motivated more by revenge against former associates than any genuine remorse. Today, as I write this final confession to you, Pastor Williams, Margaret is in the garden behind our house, training Duke and 3 other rescue German shepherds in basic obedience. We've started a nonprofit organization called Betty May's Guardians, providing trained protection dogs to families who've been threatened for seeking justice in difficult cases. Duke has become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, visiting police academies and courthouses to demonstrate how animals can assist in investigations. But to us, he's just family, the guardian angel who saved our lives and taught us that loyalty, courage, and love are the most powerful forces in the world. Sometimes the best miracles come in the most ordinary packages. Sometimes justice arrives on 4 legs with a wet nose and a heart full of devotion. And sometimes the darkest storms really do bring the brightest rainbows, if you're brave enough to wait for them. Margaret calls me from the garden, her voice carried on the warm spring breeze. Duke barks once, his all-clear signal, and I know it's time to join my family. The past is finally at peace. The present is full of love, and the future stretches ahead of us like an open road under clear skies. Some stories end with revenge or retribution, but the best ones end with redemption and hope. Ours is one of the good ones, and we have Duke to thank for that. As my mother always said, the truth will set you free. But she never mentioned it might come with 4 legs, a wagging tail, and enough courage to face down evil itself. I fold this confession and hand it to you, Pastor Williams, my soul finally clean of the secrets that nearly destroyed everything I held dear. Outside, Duke barks again, not in warning this time, but enjoy. And I know it's time to go home to the family that love built from the ashes of tragedy. The end. Dear friends, this story of Margaret, Robert, and Duke reminds us that it's never too late for love to triumph over life's darkest moments. How many of us have felt that familiar ache of loss, betrayal, or missed opportunities? Yet here we see that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest trials. Margaret's poisoning led to exposing decades of corruption. Robert's mother's death, though tragic, ultimately brought justice for countless families, and Duke, a wounded puppy found on a rainy highway, became the hero who saved them all. This isn't just a story about a remarkable German shepherd. It's about the power of second chances, the strength found in vulnerability, and the truth that family isn't always blood, but always love. At 55, 60, or 68, we know life can be cruel, but we also know it can be miraculous. Sometimes the very thing that breaks our heart open is what lets the light in. Margaret chose forgiveness over bitterness. Robert chose truth over silence. And Duke chose loyalty over safety. What will you choose today? Share with us. Have you experienced a moment when what seemed like your worst day became the beginning of your best chapter? What Duke, whether person or pet, has been your unexpected guardian angel?